Okay. Well, thank you this morning. This is part 4 of 9. This will be the last one, I think. Yeah, for Solomon. Anyway, I was gone a few days. Went down to visit my brother down in Lemoore, down in Kings County. Took the train.
Oh, nice.
First time I ever taken the train. Well,
Jazzy used to do that all the time.
it's this down to Hanford. Great way to travel. $66 round trip. You can't drive. You can't buy gas for that. And it was great. Well, I was on the train once before, but it was a bad experience because when I was on the train, a bunch of guys jumped on the train with masks on, held us up. I was at Knott's Berry Farm, but anyway. Okay, so we're going to try and finish up we are going to finish talking about Solomon today. So just a quick review. What we're going to talk about, we'll review last week, and we'll talk, this is what we'll be going into about the demise of Solomon. And we'll have a few final thoughts and summary of things. So, again, we're here at this part. Remember, this part of the timeline of Christianity up here in the United Kingdom, the last of the United Kingdom. We're kind of ending the United Kingdom now. Just a little quick review of what we've covered in the last few weeks. So I think when you think about Solomon, you really have to think about how he was set up. I mean, he was the third of the 3 kings of the United Kingdom, and I think his success as a king, and all leads to his demise also. But he was set up for success because his dad, King David, set him up well. He was well educated. David had accumulated a lot of wealth via trade and other things. He was pretty rich, so Solomon's kind of born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He has quite a bit already. David had set up quite a structure of administration, and Solomon builds on that. So he had that going for him. Most important thing I think David left his son with was peace. He had pretty much put down their enemies or confined them. So that was probably the most important thing. I mean, David, I guess, he instilled in his son a lot of wisdom and stuff, but I mean, as far as chance for success, he left him with peace. God also guaranteed that he was going to be successful, but it was conditional, which is what really is kind of a theme for today. He didn't meet the conditions that God had set forth. We talked about the beginning of his kingdom. He assumed his ascension to the throne. At the beginning, he's like all these kings. He's pretty spiritual, very in tune to God in the beginning. Like all of them, they kind of backslide. One of the most important things is he had a conversation with God early on. God asked him, "What would you like?" And he said, "I would like wisdom and discernment," which God was very pleased with. He said, "You're going to have that. You're going to have a lot more as long as you're obedient." Very important. Got to be obedient. Early on, he starts one of his things that becomes his downfall: marrying foreign women. It was the first really important marriage he had with Pharaoh's daughter. It was a treaty. It helped cement a lot of their political relationships, but it kind of starts the downfall. A pinnacle of his kingship probably was the building of the temple. That's kind of the pinnacle, I think, of his existence. So he was known for being a wise ruler and administrator, a great architect and builder. We talked about this last week. He did a lot of building, not only in Jerusalem, but around the whole kingdom of Israel. And he grew the wealth of his father tremendously, which we'll talk about. Okay, we talked a little bit, just put in history, and I'm not going to go through this again, but King Solomon here is reigning about 970 BC through 930 BC, about that period of time. And there are other things going on in the world at that time, which we talked about. Okay. We talked a lot about this, and I'm just going to summarize it again. Again, if you're going to study about this period, the United Kingdom, the divided kingdom, there's a lot of the Bible that's devoted to this. But specifically with Solomon, he is reported to be the author of 2 of the Psalms and most of, not all of the Proverbs. He wrote the Song of Songs or Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is kind of really ties to where we are in the discussion about Solomon, because the book of Ecclesiastes, which we believe was authored by Solomon, it was written in the latter part of his kingship, and it chronicles, he's chronicling his life, if you will. But he's couches it in terms of a man's life's work. He investigates and comes to conclusions as it relates to activities that have gone on in his life, actually. They're spoken kind of generically, but his conclusion, I say here, the primary issues of life after the fall of man, because when you look at Solomon's life, very much like the fall of man. We've got to look at that. So you start out divine blessing to be enjoyed, but divine judgment if you're not prepared. If you're disobedient, there will be divine judgment. So that was pretty important. I think in the end, it really highlights at the end of his life that he's a repentant man. Like, there's scholars talk about, is Solomon go to heaven? Well, I think absolutely. He believed in God. He was a follower of God. He went downhill, but in the end, he was very definitely a repentant man, knew that he had done a lot of things that were not right in the eyes of God. So let's just talk a little bit about Solomon's demise. So I want to kind of do a little definitional things here. So I'm going to talk a little difference between grandeur, which we talked about last week, all the great things that he did, grandeur, versus decadence. Because we have grandeur, which is impressive beauty, large scale, magnificent, great, splendor, all those things. That's grandeur. But if you look at it a different way and you look at it from a decadence perspective, you have luxurious self-indulgence. You had moral and cultural decline, excessive indulgence in pleasure. So these are things you're going to think about. Grandeur, we can look at what Solomon did, and we can look at it from perspective and say, it was massive, it was grand. But if you look at his life from a decadence perspective, you get a little different picture of Solomon. So the sins that are kind of tied, that I kind of say are tied to this decadence as far as Solomon is concerned, we got extravagance, oppression, sensuality, evil companionship, and idolatry. These are things that we will see in Solomon's life that highlight this decadence of Solomon, right? So extravagance, excessive, just excessive use of the good things that he had. Just there, he's oppressive. he has oppression on the people. We'll see that. He's married to lots of women. It very much becomes a sensuality thing. Those same women are evil companions. They lead him down a bad trail that is against God's will, which includes idolatry, and sometimes at a very massive scale. When we look at some of these, I just highlighted some of the major things that he did. He built the temple. In my opinion, that was a pinnacle of his, just the temple to God, for God. His father wanted that. He was like, I live in a palace and the Lord is in a tent. And David wanted a temple to honor the Lord and to have him a home. God said he couldn't do it because he was a sinful and bloody man, but his son would be allowed to do it. So early in Solomon's life, or kingship, certainly within the first 10 years, he builds the most magnificent of temples. You know, one of the wonders of the world at the time, just a magnificent building. I would say that was in honor of God. But let's look at what some of the other things he did. He built this magnificent, huge palace complex, ornate, elaborate, for all his goodies. I don't think that was for the honor of God. That was decadence on his part. He had a massive, we talked about this, massive income. How much did we say? It's 666 talents. It's like almost $1 trillion a year in income. A lot of money coming in, even those days. Even today, it's a lot of money. He did things with all this gold. He built 600 large shields of gold, some smaller, 600, another 300 more. He built a massive, magnificent throne out of ivory, covered in gold. I don't think those things were in the honor of God. You know, those were not lifting up God. That was lifting up Solomon. The throne was surrounded by 14 lions of gold around his throne. Everything they drank out of only vessels made of pure gold, no silver, gold. He acquired thousands, he imported and built, but he also imported hundreds, thousands of chariots and thousands of horses imported. Spent a lot of money doing this. Some of those were very expensive. This is not in the honor of the Lord, not at all. This is his decadence. And last but not least, he has hundreds of wives and concubines. I don't think that was in, I think as we'll talk about here in a minute, when you look at that, yeah, a lot of that we talked about was treaties, ways of building political alliances and going for peace. But I think he just became a lustful man, and it appears that those things may have been excuses to perpetuate his lust. Okay, so let's just look a little bit at a couple of these things. So God saw that Solomon was going to have a problem. I mean, he foretold this stuff. And so if you remember, Solomon had two major conversations with God. Early on, when he was ascended to the throne, he had the dream and he had a discussion with God. And God told him, you're going to have all this, but you have to be obedient. You have to follow my commands. You need to do that. He told him, if you don't, things are going to happen to you. Later on, when he dedicated the temple, which would be about 8 or so years later, Another conversation when basically those things are repeated. God's repeated this to him, that if you don't or aren't obedient, bad things are going to happen to you and your kingdom. So he was duly warned. He starts out well, but over time, like so many things in the Old Testament, it starts going downhill. Over time, he violates God's law, and things are just going to get worse and worse. So he had extraordinary wisdom for sure, and he acquired astronomical amounts of wealth. Obtaining wealth in itself is not a problem. There's nothing, God doesn't have anything bad to say about that, but if you're greedy about that and are harming, if you will, other people to acquire this wealth, not good. Okay, so having wealth in and of itself is not something God is against, but how you acquire it absolutely is. He was a bright man, a curious man, but he imported things. I mean, I think when we talked about birds, remember I talked about he brought in peacocks, other wild animals, apes, and he was collector of things. So he indulged with his luxury in things that had nothing to do with the honor of God. They were just him being a rich man, doing what he wanted. And he accumulated this, we talked about this some before, but he accumulated this wealth on the backs of his people. They were heavily taxed. I don't know what that means. I mean, I don't know relative what that means. We know that at the end of his life, when his son takes over, the people petition, say, please do something about the high taxes. And the son refuses and actually ratchets it up. So it was a problem. He was already using all the alien labor, the countries they had acquired or conquered. He was using them, those people. They were basically slaves to Solomon in his building projects. It gets bad. Later on, he actually conscripts his army into labor to build his projects. None of this can be rationalized as honoring God. I mean, these were just things this rich man wanted to do.
Could go back to where God told Samuel about what happened with Saul. Solomon did similar things.
Yes.
You give that guy too much power, he's going to take advantage of your sons,
That's,
your soldiers.
You want a king, you're going to get a king, and this is what's going to happen. Power corrupts, absolutely.
Like in Deuteronomy, when God was predicting Israel after a king, he said not to have chariots and horses, and more than one wife.
Yep. Yeah, Deuteronomy lays out a lot of stuff that are how he is violating God's law. So he married all these foreign women. He allowed them to worship their native gods. He went so far as to build altars in Jerusalem for their gods. And in the end, he was participating in the worship. So backsliding all the way, maybe he was covering all his bases, just in case, who knows, maybe that other god may be. Anyway, he participated, and not good. And this stuff, we keep asking, how do you have 700 wives or 300 concubines? We don't know. But it's very apparent, because it doesn't tell you where all these came from, really. Just alludes to things. But you really do see the effect on his life of what all this did to him. It affected him. When you think about it, I mean, he dies fairly early. He's only 60 years old. but he was a worn out, broken old man by that time, because he had led this debased life. So the Bible doesn't spell out those things specifically, but makes it very clear that this is major part of his downfall. So, how are we doing here? Oh, we're in good shape. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what the consequences of this are, because God had warned him that these things were going to have. And you can, God is patient. He's so patient. He finally gets fed up with Solomon and says, his anger just is, I told you not to do these things. I told you, you and your people are going to suffer because of this. And we always have to remember that leaders have more responsibility than the ordinary man. God is going to punish them even harsher, but the people are going to suffer because of their, in this case, disobedience. So what God had told him he was going to do was that he's going to split his kingdom. He's going to tear it in two. But he did say, I'm going to continue the Davidic covenant. I still will honor that through your lineage, the king, the Messiah will come and the kingdom will continue, but he's going to tear it up. He's going to divide it up. Most of his tribes, if you will, are going to go to somebody that was his servant. And we talked last year, maybe, and we were talking about the 8th century. We talked about Jeroboam, but Jeroboam was in Solomon's court, if you will. I kind of categorized the man as an entrepreneur. He was up and comer. He did well. He had approached Solomon about, backing off on some things, and Solomon decided he didn't like him. He was going to get rid of him. Jeroboam runs off to Egypt. They all seem to scurry off to Egypt. It's just a very common thing. But when God said, I'm going to split your kingdom, he's doing that. So he splits it and allows, if you will, Jeroboam to come back. And Jeroboam comes back and becomes the leader of the northern tribes. But God told this is not going to last. These people are going to be put into servitude. So God painted a very bleak picture to him what was going to happen because of their disobedience. He also brought up adversaries at the end, adversaries that were really kind of adversaries of his father, David. And they were still around and kind of like rebels out there, but there was also this internal uprising that he had to deal with at that same time. So we have his adversaries, including Jeroboam, and like I said, Solomon ends up dying in about 930 BC at the age of 60. Fairly young man, but these are it's a good point to see if anybody has any comments or questions, because Solomon, really and Israel pays the price for this disobedience. In a minute, we'll talk a little bit about him versus the other kings. But at this time, Solomon, God had warned him, finally had enough, and executed the disobedience plan, if you will. Yes, Terry?
It's a good example even today with how God may be angry with us, but he holds it back because he's trying to get as many people saved as he can before he throws the wrath on them.
Yeah, God's always holding back.
Yeah.
I'm always kind of amazed how much he holds back. You wonder today, how much longer is he going to hold back before, taking care of this decadent world? Okay, just a couple of final things here. So, I categorize when you're looking at this, look at the kings. I think there's this correlation with the fall of man, right? The fall of man. Adam and Eve had it. They had it made. You know, all they had to do was obey, and it wasn't even hard. You know, it was pretty simple. Obedience was pretty simple. But they didn't, and they entered a state of, became guilty, and they were disobedient, and they paid the price, and we pay the price since then. Okay? So when you look at the three kings of the United Kingdom, we start with Saul. How does Saul start out? He was good. He didn't want to be king. Remember, he did not want to be king. But he started out well, but he backslid very quickly, disobeyed God almost immediately. And God, I think God was not anywhere near as patient with Saul as he was with Solomon. But not long into his reign, he decides, no, I'm going to make David will become the king. And over the next few years, David develops. David, he's the best king. I mean, he is our role model. Not in everything he did, but I think what sets David out from Saul and Solomon is he loved God. He was always a follower of God. He was a sinner, absolutely was a sinner, but he was always repentant all along. He tried to instill that into his son when he first, in that co-regency period, when he kind of tried to instill in him all the knowledge and what he should do and shouldn't do. And he really emphasized, being obedient to the Lord. Yes?
I think also by having him being educated by Nathan, he's hoping.
Yeah, he had a really good religious education as far as he was taught by the prophet. And he had everything going for him. But David really said, you've got to be, remember when Solomon starts out, when he has his administration, he highlights the priests rather than the generals, opposite of David. So he starts out really well, but he absolutely backslid. And when we talk about his grandeur, and like we talked about Solomon, nothing was just, there's no these big breaks. It's just a gradual, as his grandeur grew, so did his disobedience. It was a gradual thing. And it's just, was it Reagan that said power corrupts absolutely? Power corrupts absolutely. Is that Reagan who said that, or somebody else? I don't know. But excellent example. So David was humble man. There isn't a lot of discussion about David's wealth. We know he was, but he accumulated all this wealth for the glory of God. He wanted this temple built. Solomon was not that way. He was showing off. He wanted to be, and by the way, that was not an unusual trait for kings of that era. They were always trying to one-up each other and be showy. There's absolutely no reason for Saul to be expressing himself this way with such luxury and stuff. That's bad enough. But he did it by oppressing his own people, taxed them heavily, burdened them with labor, did a lot of stuff all for, I'm doing it for God, haha, doing it for the glory of the kingdom. I'm doing all this stuff to make us great and grand. It was all for him.
I do additionally think that the people did love Solomon, though, and I think Rehoboam's problem was he hadn't earned their trust. So as much as he did tax and work the people, sometimes we have employers that are that way, that we'll put the extra hours in because our boss has done really well for us, taking care of us. Then you get the young buck coming in trying to just flex muscle because he's got the title, got the badge. And it's like,
I think we talked about that last week when somebody asked about, were people poor? But we have no indication that it appears that the people of the kingdom, they were prospering. It was a prosperous time, but they were heavily taxed.
yeah.
They didn't need all that tax. He didn't need all this grandeur. He didn't need all that. Yes.
I mean, it said silver was common among everybody during his time.
Yes, it was very common for the kings. If you look at the pharaohs or Nebuchadnezzar and all these, they all did that. But what is just hard to understand is, why did Solomon continue to do these things? They weren't for the glory of God, they were for the glory of Solomon.
It's like Hezekiah when he went and showed off the stuff in the temple to that Babylonian emissary, and then the prophet came back. What you just did was allow Babylonian king to come and desire what you have.
I mean, this story kind of repeats itself all through the Old Testament. It's not an unusual story.
Like my sermons, Brother Phil.
What's that?
It's like my sermons. Same sermon, different text. I have 4 sermons, it's just the same sermon, different text. That's it.
Anyway, okay. So that's pretty much. I'm pretty much through. I don't know how much more we want to talk about Solomon. Does anybody have any questions?
Very good lesson.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's end with prayer. I didn't start with prayer either. Did it again. And listen, dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for this time together. Thank you for the opportunity to delve into your word, to understand more of the culture of the times, and to emphasize the importance of our obedience to you, Lord. We will have everything we want and need. Just be obedient. And if we aren't obedient, we will be judged in the end. I just ask that you bless the rest of our day in Jesus' name. Amen.